Welcome, everyone. We're going to have a conversation about the implementation of Mexico's very important labor reforms and their connection to the implementation of the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. We're very fortunate to have with us today María de la Mora, Undersecretary of Economy, who covers many international affairs, including USMCA implementation, and Ricardo Aranda, who's the Director General for International Trade Discipline in the Economics Ministry. Andrew Rudman, the Director of the Mexico Institute, is with us here today, and my name is Tony Wayne. I'm a Public Policy Fellow at the Mexico Institute and co-chair of the Advisory Board for the Mexico Institute. So let's start off. Maybe I could ask you, Undersecretary de la Mora, to say, start off and tell us a little bit about where Mexico is in this 4-year plan of implementing these really revolutionary labor reforms.
Well, thank you, Tony. It's great to be with you and with the Mexico Institute today. Thanks for the opportunity of sharing with your audience what we have done in Mexico with respect to the labor reform. Let me start by putting a little bit of perspective on this implementation of this labor reform. President López Obrador started his administration with a clear commitment to improving the life of workers in every aspect. So this implied, among other things, increasing the wages of workers in Mexico. This meant that in 2019, there was an increase of 16% of minimum wage. In 2020, a 20% increase of the minimum wage, and in 2021, a 15% of the minimum wage. So if we do sort of a calculation, we would say that in the first 3 years of this administration, we have increased minimum wage by close to 50%. We know that we're coming from a very low base, but it tells you something about the values that we have in this administration. And this is that we do not want to be a country whose competitiveness is based on low labor wages. We are interested in having a strong, organized labor sector that can take advantage of the reforms that Mexico undertook since 2017. This implementation of this reform that we are living today comes from a constitutional reform that Mexico went through since 2017. And the objective of that reform was to promote democracy and justice in the labor sector. So these are two key words that we need to take into consideration when we're considering the kind of changes that Mexico is undergoing right now. I do not think that I am overstating this by saying that the new labor laws that we are implementing since May of 2019 and the constitutional reform from 2017 amount to a fundamental structural reform in Mexico that will change the way labor and employers relate to each other with respect to freedom of association, collective bargaining, and labor justice. So this may seem to be just another reform in Mexico or a new law, but we're really talking about dramatic changes in the way workers are being able to negotiate their working conditions. And this is also part of USMCA. This is part of Chapter 23 of USMCA and part of the Annex 23A and 23B, which basically also include commitments in which Mexico has agreed to fully implement its labor reform. So this historic labor reform is based on three main pillars. Guaranteeing union democracy by ensuring that workers can offer their ballots in a secret, direct, free way. It also entails an effective collective bargaining of workers' conditions with respect to their collective contract, and also a new labor justice, which entails a new structure of labor courts, labor tribunals, that will make sure that workers will have access to effective justice. So this is the kind of reform that Mexico is going through at the national level, but it also is related to the commitments that Mexico has under USMCA. And I think that at the end of the day, there is a complete coincidence in terms of the vision that Mexico, Canada, and the US have with respect to making sure that integration in North America is inclusive and also offers benefits to everyone in the region, including the workforce.
Thank you.
Thank you, Undersecretary de la Mora. That's I think that point that Mexico was undertaking labor reform at the same time that USMCA was being negotiated is an important one, and a case where the trade agreement. I think I welcome you and Ricardo to jump in and correct me, but in a sense, the trade agreement wasn't the impulse for the changes, but it certainly bolsters the changes, gives it a little bit of additional backing, let's say.
Part of the background, if I may jump in, part of the background relates to a public consultation, a public exercise with a very open reach that took place a couple of years ago, which included within its results a series of consultations emphasizing the need of an adjustment to the labor justice system. And that's why the constitutional reform mentioned by Undersecretary de la Mora in 2017 was enacted. Then the operational changes came, and now we are going through each one of the changes that are included in the federal labor law.
Right. If I could, I'll just follow up. You both mentioned, of course, USMCA, which has a novel mechanism, a mechanism that I think no other free trade agreement anywhere has yet, with strict timelines for investigating possible violations of the provisions, and then a system of consultations and essentially assessment of whether or not a violation has occurred. USTR recently introduced a case concerning the contract voting at a General Motors plant. There's also a case raised by the AFL-CIO regarding practices at a plant in Mora. So maybe Undersecretary or Director General, maybe you could talk a little bit about how you view those cases, how the Mexican government is engaging and responding.
Sure. Well, let me start by giving you a little bit of background of where we are with respect to this case. This case was presented to us just a few days ago, in which the concern that was presented to us by USTR has to do with the actual process of legitimizing the contract of the plant of Silao of General Motors. We received a request for review from USTR concerning this case. And this has to do with what we were already mentioning with respect to the implementation of the reform. The implementation of the reform is designed to take place in 3 stages. a specific number of states will implement this reform in 2020. Second stage, 13 states will implement it by 2021, and 11 states will implement it by 2022. In the case of Guanajuato, which is where this case is taking place, in Guanajuato, the new justice system will be effective this year. So what we're seeing, what we mean by the new justice system, it means that we will be able to ensure that Guanajuato, in this case, has complied with the reforms to its local constitution. So Guanajuato has this year to reform its local constitution to reflect the labor reform. Guanajuato also has to reform its local judiciary. And also, there are some legal adjustments for the establishment of local centers for conciliation. So in this case, what we are seeing is the operation of this new system on the ground. What we're saying on the ground, why we're saying on the ground, because what USTR in this case is asking us in Mexico to revise is how is it that this legitimization of the collective contract, labor contract, was done. And there are questions with respect to the way in which it was done, and if this is consistent with what we have agreed, not only in USMCA, but for us, more importantly, with respect to what the reform states. And this is one of the reasons why, even before we received a notification from the USTR, already the Ministry of Labor had been in charge of revising the process, and it had already started taking steps to place this negotiation in line with commitments that we have in our own labor reform law. So I think that what we're seeing here is the implementation of this labor reform that, as I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, really entails a very dramatic change in the way labor and employers relate to each other through their unions. We are all in the process of adjusting. We are all in the process of learning. Workers are learning about their rights, how to exercise their rights. Unions are learning how they need to adapt new processes, how they have to relate to their base. And also firms are also learning about the implementation. So it is a complex situation what we have right now, but I think that we cannot lose track of the fact that Mexico, the Mexican government, the Mexican private sector, governors, unions, we are all on board, and we're all working to make sure that this transition takes place in such a way that we are really moving into a better conditions, into the possibility of offering better conditions, better worker conditions, and better income for workers. So we cannot keep this aside. Thank you.
If I may jump in also, I would just like to say that the name of the game that we see in this new process, on this new stage where the US has presented this request, is engagement. So we want to avoid mentioning the word confrontation and substitute that word by engagement. Engaging with our counterparts, and as Undersecretary de la Mora mentioned, engaging with the relevant stakeholders that are on the ground and that are related to the specific process. Thank you.
And I think, Ricardo, just building on that from all I've seen about this case, in fact, your own labor inspectors early on detected that there appeared to be irregular voting and tampering with the ballots by the union currently empowered in the plant. And they intervened. And then a number of other people used the hotlines that are available to say there was fraud going on here. And both sides of the border heard that. And so then there has been consultation in moving forward in doing this. And I think the company also has been quite clear that they want to have full respect for democratic procedures in this process. So this is a very good case of engagement and moving forward, and we'll see how it unfolds in the weeks ahead. But that engagement seems to be taking place. Now, the other case, and I know you might not be able to talk about this in as much detail, is one that's just been filed by the AFL-CIO, but it's one that has gotten a lot of attention in the months before because of a very active labor leader there, Susana Prieto, and a not too welcoming local environment, if I understand, around this plant in Matamoros. And it's an interesting plant because it's in Mexico, owned by a US firm, which in turn is owned by a Canadian firm. So it ties together all three companies in USMCA. And if I understand correctly, Matamoros is one of the states where the reform will not be implemented until for a little while. So I don't know what exactly you can say about this because it's only been filed with the US authorities and US authorities have yet to formally notify you, but this is another use of this new procedure available only in USMCA. So we'd be very happy to hear your thoughts about this.
Sure. Well, Tony, let me start and then I'll allow Ricardo to complement what I have to say here. That's right. We have not received an official notification of the Ministry of Economy from USTR concerning this Matamoros case. We expect to receive it in the next days. However, I think that it is important to mention that when a union, like in this case, presents a case to the US government, the US government will have to revise it and determine if the request really complies with the elements that are established in USMCA to put it forward. I can tell you that this is part of a process of transformation, probably an adjustment in Matamoros in this case, but I have to say that this process horizontally across the country. We are, as you mentioned, in the process of implementing the new labor justice system. That's right. Tamaulipas will only complete its process in 2022. However, that doesn't mean that we are not doing a lot already. And let me just offer you a couple of points for you to understand how we have made progress in Mexico with respect to implementation of the labor reform. With respect to unions need to adjust their bylaws in order to comply with the labor reform. I can tell you that almost all of the labor unions at the federal level, all of them that have a federal register, almost 94% of them have already adjusted their bylaws. So that talks to you about the kind of work that we have done here in Mexico, whereas at the local level, close to 30% of labor unions that are constituted at the local level have already adjusted their bylaws, and they still have until the end of 2023 to complete this process. Now, when we talk about the legitimization of collective bargaining agreements, I can also share with you that there have been more than 2,100 consultations that have taken place. Close to 900 collective bargaining agreements have been legitimized, and close to 250,000 workers have been consulted. So this also, I mean, these numbers show you that we're moving, that we are really making the changes that we need to make. And one last point that I want to make has to do with the budget. President López Obrador committed to the implementation of the first stage of the labor reform. The government allocated $15 million from federal resources to states for implementing the labor reform. And also, we are seeing that looking forward to the implementation at the next stage, we're looking at a budget of close to $23 million for the next stage. Now, how does this money translate into this new labor reform? That's precisely what we're seeing. We're seeing new ways of negotiating collective contracts. We're seeing inspectors going to the plants to verify that collective bargaining is taking place, that democracy of workers and freedom of association in terms of the collective bargaining is taking place. And the Ministry of Labor is doing a fantastic job, really a very intense job with a lot of human resources, creating institutions, and also making sure that this reform is going to have the institutional ground that it needs to make sure that cases like what we may be seeing in Matamoros are not the rule in Mexico.
Thank you very much.
And maybe just to complement two comments. The first one is that labor reform provides for a 4-year term for as the USMCA to legitimize all the collective bargaining agreements. But this is not subject to the establishment of the institutions in the states. So even though the institutions related to the new labor justice system, like the tribunals mentioned by Undersecretary de la Mora or the conciliation centers, might not be in place until a specific time frame, this does not mean that the Ministry of Labor in Mexico, whom I adhere to the Undersecretary's comments about their fantastic work, is not ready. This does not mean that they are not ready to oversee and to promote the legitimization of the contract. So this is something that needs to move forward, and that needs to take into consideration the timeframes that are provided under the commitments and the law.
Thank you both. I know that your time is short, but maybe we could I could just ask one final question. Undersecretary de la Mora mentioned expenditure on the Mexican side from the Mexican budget. The U.S. government also appropriated about $200 million for technical assistance. Maybe you could give us a sense of, so far, how are those funds being used, and maybe a little bit more broadly, what kind of technical assistance is Mexico receiving from the U.S. or from Canada, and essentially how is that technical assistance process going so far?
Well, I would just like to give an initial comment, and probably Ricardo, who is responsible for the implementation of this cooperation with the Ministry of Labor, can offer a more detailed answer. What I can tell you is that the cooperation that we have with Canada and the US, both at the level of the Ministry of Economy and the Labor Ministry, is focused on how we can make sure that our commitments in USMCA and our legislation in Mexico is effectively implemented through changes that we need to make, changes at the organizational level, at the institutional level, and also technical training. We have done a lot of work in Mexico with the private sector, with unions and workers, to explain to them what is the new model of labor justice. And I think that it takes a little bit of time to adopt structural changes, but I have no doubt that we are on the right track. Ricardo, can you complement, please?
Sure. Thank you very much, Secretary. And thanks for the question. Well, even though I may not be able to provide specific numbers, given that they are under the direct responsibility of the Ministry of Labor, what I can tell you is that STPS, our Secretariat of Labor and Social Welfare, has been in close communication and contact with its counterparts of both the US and Canada. On the US side, the Department of Labor has supported the STPS through cooperation projects to strengthen institutional capacities, both in the ministry, in STPS, in the Secretariat, and in the new Federal Center for Labor Conciliation and Registration, which is one of the institutions that was established on behalf of the labor reform. Regarding Canada's involvement, there has been also constant dialogue about the implementation of labor reform. In particular, there is a bilateral working group between labor authorities of Canada and Mexico. And within this group, Canada has also offered and expressed interest to support projects regarding the strengthening institutional capacities in STPS. For example, one of the projects that was at some point discussed was the possibility of receiving support for the digitalization of documents that are now under the conciliation and arbitration boards, and which account for millions of pages that need to be digitalized now under the new requirements of the law, and in order to have an appropriate use of information and communication technologies. I may just add, just to conclude, that the communication is not constrained to the technical level or to the operative level within the ministries. And a sign of this interesting and constant dialogue that is taking place is that Secretary Alcalde, who is the Mexican Minister of Labor, recently held a conversation with its Canadian counterpart, Filomena Tassi, and this is just a sign of the interest to discuss a wide range of issues at all the levels that are in the hierarchy. So this is an ongoing agenda, and if I just may add, we will certainly build upon what is being done through the next week meeting of the Free Trade Commission that shall take place between the ministers of our three countries. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ricardo. And thank you very much, Luz María de la Mora, Undersecretary, Madame Undersecretary. Thank you both for sharing this. It's quite clear that it's a very ambitious reform. It takes a lot of detailed work, a lot of, as we just heard, technological work to get everything working well, and a lot of re-education of many people. It's right. Upskilling in action for everybody. How do you apply these new rights, these new rules? And I think that the word that Ricardo mentioned earlier about engagement is very important, to keep the dialogue going, to keep learning from each other, and to keep learning from all the stakeholders and involving all the stakeholders in this. As we've said before, some will be enthusiastic about the reform and some will be less enthusiastic about the reform. So it is going to take constant engagement to make this work. And we at the Wilson Center are here to be supportive of this process to all parties as it goes forward, and we look forward to continuing this dialogue with you. Andrew, please wrap up for us.
Thanks, Ambassador Wayne. Well, let me reiterate our thanks to Undersecretary de la Mora and Director General Aranda. We really appreciate having you with us here today. And look forward to continuing this dialogue. I'll also mention that we will shortly post on our webpage a short paper by Secretaries Cloutier and Alcalde entitled "Toward a More Inclusive Region for Workers," which links the current efforts in Mexico to historic efforts to improve labor rights here in the United States and in Mexico, and reinforces Mexico's intent to meet its USMCA obligations. Which is obviously extremely important. We're committed, as the ambassador said, to fostering and promoting that dialogue and understanding. So we look forward to continuing this dialogue and hopefully to hosting both of you in Washington as soon as conditions allow. So thank you again for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.